They've got fake stories out now about how they're finding microparticles, microplastic in the bloodstream and in cells and all this stuff. I don't know where they get it from, but the turtle with a straw in its eye was staged.
All right, guys, welcome back to Yanasa TV's As a Man Thinketh. Love him or hate him, our guest today is a man who is no stranger to controversy. As a doctor of ecology from the University of British Columbia, and he actually has an honorary doctorate of science from NC State University. Patrick Moore has been on both the front lines of the environmental movement, and he has, some would say he's been on the front lines of the opposite side. However, I would argue that as an ecologist, Patrick Moore takes a realistic standpoint to science, and the things and points that he has to say will really make you think about our environment, our climate, and what impacts we make that are good and what impacts we make that are bad. He's not saying that all of our impacts are beneficial. Patrick Moore has a lot of great insight on this subject, and so I asked him to come on to the show to kind of help share some of that insight with you guys and help people start to see things from a perspective. Not all scientists agree with some sort of consensus out there, and I think that the more you listen to different people with doctorate degrees and real PhDs, the more you'll start to hear differences of opinion on this subject, and they're all very educated. I like Patrick Moore's opinion on some things. He and I don't agree on everything, but like I've said before on our channel, that's not what this is about. This is about helping people start to think for themselves, and we're not going to do that unless we hear the whole conversation. So welcome to the show, Patrick Moore. With all these movements that you see out there, you see things like Extinction Rebellion, breaking laws, shutting down streets. Do you think that this current environmental movement that's full of, misleading information and just elaborate schemes, do you think it's actually turning people away from caring about the environment, kind of making them say, just screw it? And do you consider yourself an environmentalist, even though you don't buy into the narrative?
Well, I primarily think of myself as an ecologist, but a lot of people don't know what that means. So I do describe myself as an environmentalist, and Wikipedia went so far as to strip me of that title. I'm now just a consultant, which I have done consulting. I'm primarily a public speaker. But if you look, you're not allowed to edit your own Wikipedia page, your own biography. Only other people can edit it, unless you get permission to edit it. And nobody will ever give me permission to change anything. There's a committee of 30-some people who decide on whether I'm allowed to call myself an environmentalist or not. And they voted against me. Not all of them, but a majority. And then I have a PhD in ecology. They say I have a PhD in forestry. It is true that the head of my thesis committee was a forest ecologist, Hamish Kimmins, one of the finest in the world. He just passed away not long ago. I was his first graduate student at the University of British Columbia, and he was a brilliant man. But I was actually based in the Institute of Animal Resource Ecology. And the word animal isn't that important in there. It was actually an institute of ecology because they were studying a lot more than animals. And that was C.S. Halling, Buzz Halling, the professor who first created computer simulation of population dynamics in species, insects in particular, because they breed so fast. And he basically modeled that in a computer and was also one of my mentors. I had some amazingly good professors. So I did an interdisciplinary ecology program where I took courses from all kinds of different departments. I took the economics of environmental. I took the law of environmental, natural resources law and environmental law. And I took oceanography, both biological and physical oceanography. And so I went, and of course, forestry was my core subject from the beginning, but that is not what I got my PhD in. I got my Bachelor of Science honors in science, which was life science, not just forestry. And I got my PhD in ecology, which they refused to recognize on Wikipedia. Along with in the text, there's just a whole pile of propaganda in there.
Patrick, you mentioned before that air pollution is not CO2 gases, but air pollution does include certain types of aerosols. So mankind definitely isn't necessarily perfect per se. What do you think? What are your thoughts on garbage and trash? What could we be doing differently there? A lot of people are concerned with plastics, for example.
Well, I mentioned the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's actually worth going into that a little bit because it's not about the climate. It's about how plastic is bad, and especially when it's in the ocean. And I mentioned how could plastic be toxic if we wrap our food in it? Of course it isn't. It's the opposite of toxic. It's inert, and it protects our food. And when it goes in the ocean, it has way more benefit than harm. The main harm that is caused by plastic in the ocean is discarded fish nets, not because they're made of plastic, because of their shape is meant to catch marine species. And so if you throw a damaged fish net overboard, stuff gets caught in it and dies. So what the environmental community should be focused on is much more narrow than ending plastic. It should be ending discarded fish nets in the sea by working with the international community of fishermen, fishers as they're supposed to be called today, and the environmental movement should get together with fishers and figure out a program where they will be incentivized to bring their damaged nets back to the dock for recycling or used as energy in waste to energy plants or whatever, but so they don't harm anything. But generally, plastic in the sea is a boon for life in the same way that driftwood is. You may see a piece of driftwood come on the beach with stuff growing on it, like pelagic barnacles is one of the main things. But driftwood is used for species in the sea to lay their eggs on, to live on, to eat things that are growing there. It's a positive input to the sea. And plastic is no different than a piece of driftwood. Just because it's got more color and people can see it and pick it out and think, oh my God, it's pollution. No, it's just litter if you want to think of it that way. Driftwood on a beach is litter too. It's not meant to be part of the beach, in a sense. I mean, it came from down a river, usually from a flood, and ends up on beaches all around the world. And nobody complains about that. Wood is also, funnily enough, made of plastic. And because nature makes plastic, cellulose, which is what wood is largely made out of, is a polymer of glucose and therefore is a plastic. Actually, cotton is also pure cellulose, which is made from sugar and therefore is a plastic, because polymers are what plastic are: polypropylene, polyvinyl chloride, polyethylene. They just don't put the word poly in front of some of them. Cellulose should be called polyglucose because that's what it is. And so a piece of plastic floating on the ocean is totally inert, but provides a habitat and a substrate like a little coral reef, like a little floating reef. But that's one of the main benefits of plastic in the ocean, is the same benefits that the driftwood produce. But the most interesting one, and the one that the most lies are told about, is the fact that seabirds give bits of plastic to their chicks and ingest bits of plastic for the rest of their lives after they fledge from the nest, because when they're in the nest, they can't get their own bits of hard stuff. So, but it's not just plastic they're giving them. They're giving them squid beaks, which are hard. They're giving them bits of hard wood. They're giving them nuts that are suitable. And they're giving them now, since plastic is in the ocean, pumice is their favorite thing from undersea volcanoes, because it's basically a very abrasive rock that floats because it's puffed up full of air. when it comes out of the volcano. So you see these huge mats of pumice coming up to the surface in these events, but that's not always available. There hasn't always been a volcano recently below the sea where these birds are feeding. So they use bits of plastic. Sir David Attenborough, Greenpeace, and the Smithsonian never mention the word gizzard. Every bird has a gizzard. It's a second stomach that is a muscular stomach that grinds the food because birds don't have teeth and therefore have to swallow their food whole. Every bird has a gizzard, and land birds use pebbles as the digestive aid in their gizzard to grind their food. All land birds, when they're in the nest, are fed pebbles by their parents, and then when they fledge, they take in pebbles. They're not eating them, so to speak, because it's not a food. And when parents feed their chicks pebbles, they're not feeding them. They're giving them the pebbles to go into their gizzard to act as a digestive aid. For 60 years, studies have been done on seabirds like albatross and shearwaters and petrels to find out if the plastic that is being given to them is causing any harm, and no harm is being caused. But David Attenborough, Greenpeace, and the Smithsonian all say that the seabirds are feeding plastic to their chicks, mistaking it for food. Those are the words they use. It's all in my book, highly documented, with the history of studies being done on birds showing that it's not causing harm because they're simply using it as a substitute for the other hard objects that they've been using for millions of years. And it works for them, obviously, or they wouldn't be doing it. Those hard objects disappear in the gizzard because they are ground down as they are grinding the food. And so you constantly need to add new ones. That's why birds constantly come to places where there's little stones and ingest them. They're not eating them, they are ingesting them because they are not digested like the food is. They are used as a tool inside the gizzard. Look at David Attenborough's Secret Life of Birds and all of the stuff he's done on birds. He never talks about their gizzard. He talks about how seabirds are feeding plastic to their chicks, mistaking it for food, and this is killing their chicks. He says that in his videos, and he is lying. And the sad part of it is he knows he is lying. And so does Greenpeace, and so does the Smithsonian. Otherwise, they would tell us about the gizzard, wouldn't they? But they don't. So those are the two beneficial effects of plastic in the ocean, providing habitat. And one other thing about plastic is driftwood is never in the shape of a cup or a bottle with an entrance in it. Those shapes of plastic, because of its shape, in the same way that the net is a bad shape of plastic, capturing sea life inadvertently, plastic bottles and cups can be used as habitat and shelter. They can lay their eggs in there, they can have their young in there, they can seek shelter in there from predators. So when I was on the first Greenpeace Save the Whale voyage, I would throw glass containers. I didn't throw plastic ones because there weren't many then, but I would throw glass containers overboard, like beer bottles, for example. And that to the great clamor of the rest of the people there, oh my God, you shouldn't be littering the sea. I was providing habitat that would float to the sink to the bottom and be a place where a species could go in and live there. It's just a no-brainer. And glass is certainly not harmful to the ocean. And plastic is in a similar vein, plastic is not harmful to the ocean. And there are certain shapes of plastic, those things that they put on beer cans, should be stopped. And I still see them on six-packs, the plastic rings. Some species can put their head in there when they're young and then grow and still on them. They should get rid of that. But it should be very, very specific. And of course, we shouldn't be dumping vast amounts of plastic into the rivers, which is what's happening in Southeast Asia, because most of the stalls are along rivers, the vegetable stalls and stuff. And so they throw all their junk, all their waste food, and which makes the river go dead. And they throw plastic in there and it ends up in the estuary. They shouldn't be doing that.
when you're talking about plastics, what about microplastics? You hear a lot of people talk about microplastics and clothing and how that's getting into our water supply, and there's nothing in the environment to break it down. I think that's one of the biggest concerns people have with plastic is its capabilities to break down. Like driftwood will break down over time and turn into other nutrients for the ecosystem. What about plastics?
Invisible microplastics, invisible fake catastrophes. No one can see it. Because when I challenge people in an audience about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is supposedly a great swirling mass of garbage, mostly plastic, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, twice the size of Texas. It does not exist. I prove that in my book with aerial photographs from satellites. It isn't there. And when I argue with people about it, they say, yeah, but it's just below the surface. That's one of their excuses for why you can't see it. Okay, sure, every piece of plastic has a buoyancy compensation device on it, or what? No, some plastic sinks and other plastic floats, depending on its density. The floating plastic goes to the surface, but there isn't a sea of it out there. Especially the image of the Pacific Ocean taken by the German satellite over a period of a year, so it's a composite, and they've got it so that there's no clouds showing because there's clouds somewhere all the time, but there's also no clouds somewhere all the time. And they're able to put together this composite where you can see the Hawaiian Islands quite clearly. And boy, is it ever by itself in the whole Pacific Ocean. But you can see them clearly, and they are not twice the size of Texas. So this more or less proves that the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is a hoax. And so many other things. But they say, oh, but it's all microplastic in the water column. And I say, oh, you mean it's invisible? Therefore, no one can check to see if it's there or not. A fisheries scientist from Canada working for Department of Fisheries and Oceans went to the North Pacific to try to find the microplastic with a device that went up through the water column with a very fine filter in it, and thought he must have done something wrong because he didn't find anything. So I don't know of anybody else who's actually doing that work, but all I know is that they're faking us into thinking something's real when in fact it's probably not real and is invisible. But here's the main question. How did the microplastic get created if plastic doesn't degrade? Nobody's making microplastic, right? How did it happen? It happened because the plastic degrades, and the microplastic will degrade too, if there is any, right? It does degrade, and it is only made of carbon and hydrogen. And our body knows not to take it into its bloodstream. It poops it back out again, just like it would sand. Do you think if you put really, really fine micro sand in your food that your body would absorb it? No, your body, the lining of your bowels is very well capable of knowing what to and what not to put into your body. And if it's a toxic liquid, that's a different thing. I mean, you can kill yourself real easy by putting the wrong stuff into your mouth. But actual particles of stuff, they're not going to be taken in. They've got fake stories out now about how they're finding microparticles, microplastic in the bloodstream and in cells and all this stuff. I don't know where they get it from, but the turtle with a straw in its eye was staged. And so are the bodies of albatross chicks opened up, and there's more plastic in there than you could put inside the whole bird. They've just staged these things, and it's all over the internet. And the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is mostly photoshopped pictures with, someone has painted a Pacific Garbage Patch onto a map of the earth and put an arrow there saying Great Pacific Garbage Patch. But there is no actual photograph of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And you'd think if it was twice the size of Texas, there might be one. There isn't. There is a lot of plastic in the sea, but it is spread out all over the place. And as I say, it is providing a habitat for species to lay their eggs on. Plastic floats that are used for fish nets sometimes come loose. Those get covered in life. And so did glass balls when they used those before plastic was used for net floats. I've been around, I've grown up on the sea. I'm still on the sea. I've been on the Pacific Ocean all my life. I've walked the remote beaches of northern Vancouver Island. Kind of a nasty thing happened there recently. A container ship, I think there was a fire on board, and somehow or other, a whole whack of containers, 191 containers, I think it was, got off the ship, right off the north end of Vancouver Island, and they're all washing ashore. And scavengers are going out there and fighting over the stuff that's in them, and it's really quite a scene. But you don't want that to happen. But again, that it's not an environmental catastrophe. It's more of a social catastrophe than anything else. And they've shut down the beaches now because they don't want to have people shooting each other over whether they can get the loot inside these containers, because it's all stuff from China coming for the supply chain. And yeah, it's funny in a way, and it's sad in a way, but it isn't a problem for the environment. They'll figure out how to get those containers off the beach somehow, I think. Although if they didn't, they would just rust there, and that's not going to hurt anything either. As a matter of fact, a bear might decide to hibernate in one. Who knows? We are managing our municipal waste very badly in North America. 50% or more of all our combustible materials, a lot of metal and glass is recycled, like beer cans and glass containers, they are recycled. So what you're left with is almost all combustible material, plastic, paper, and wood. Some of that can be recycled, but a short piece of wood from a demolition of a house that's full of nails is not going to get recycled. And paper that is soiled and plastic that is film is not going to get recycled. So what do you do with it? You build a waste to energy plant. And France and Germany and many other of the Western European countries in particular, and Japan and China now, are building these plants. And Europe gets 4% of its electricity from waste to energy plants. It's interesting that all the combustible materials are of life origin. Plastic came from life, wood came from life, and paper came from life. You see, the reason there are any combustible materials in the world is because they came after the planet was so hot that it would have burnt them all to a crisp in the beginning. So the combustible materials are all basically from life. And we can put them into an energy plant with extremely up-to-date pollution control technology, as they do in Europe and Japan. They heat old folks' homes with waste with garbage. In Japan, in the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport, all the trash bins say waste to energy because they have one of these plants. Long Island has one. There's a few in the United States, but the green movement opposes them, calling them incinerators and saying that it will reduce the amount of recycling. No, it's proven in my book with a very clear table that the countries that recycle the most also do the most waste to energy and end up with no landfills. Germany and France basically have no landfills, and same with Sweden and Finland, I believe. The graph is in my book showing all of the European countries and how they're doing with both recycling and waste to energy. And the Eastern European countries are still landfilling a lot of their waste, whereas the Western European countries have learned to use this material to produce energy. And even the metal, the nails that are in the piece of wood, comes out the bottom and it can be recycled too. It's a total of 100% recovery of materials, either for energy or the materials themselves.
Patrick, thank you for joining us on As a Man Thinketh. I appreciate your opinions on these things, and I hope that everything that you had to say helps those out there want to research more and understand a little more about our ecology and how all of these things work together, and why there's a lot of fear out there that they don't have to buy into. And in fact, in my opinion, I think that this fear-mongering that's going on is turning people away from caring about our environment. I've always said that people you shouldn't have to scare people into caring about their environment. It's something we should all naturally want to do for our environment. But when you start to throw out misinformation, or you start to throw out things that just aren't scientifically accurate. They can't be scientifically accurate. What it ends up doing is it actually turns people off from caring about the environment. And that's the last thing that anybody wants. And so I appreciate your thoughts. I think that it's important that we look at things from a scientific reality. And then from there, people can decide, how they want to move forward. They don't have to worry as much about how every little thing that they're doing is impacting the environment, but they can start thinking about how they want to treat their environment and make it the most productive use of their footprint.